Today I'm in the Cavalry and Guards Club in central London with historian Dan Snow. And these podcasts for the National Centre for Military Intelligence have been sharing the secrets of military intelligence. Today I'm going to discuss with Dan the importance of sharing the secrets of history. Dan, thank you for joining me. How did you get interested in history?
I want to share my innermost secrets now. I was interested, it was not an option in my family. Everyone was interested in history. I didn't know there were any other subjects.
Yeah.
It came as a nasty shock when I went to school and discovered there was maths and English and science and things. And so we're all history mad. My grandmother, was an oral historian, the great Welsh tradition. She would tell me stories about generations of our family, and she'd make it very relevant to me because she gave me the sense that these people weren't just relics in the past. My great Tide, my great grandmother, my great Nine, they were people whose actions fundamentally were at the very foundation of my life. So why was I a tall English kid with a Canadian passport living in West London, in a privileged surroundings? Well, it was because of decisions that had been made by my Tide, the other great grandfather who went out to India to make his fortune, whatever it might be. I was left in no doubt, and I was also left in no doubt that their strengths and weaknesses I'd somehow inherited from. This was where the sort of folk magic comes in, a bit of sort of magic realism. But those people mattered in my life because she'd say, "You're just like your great aunt Megan." Now and I'd be like, "Oh God, I better concentrate on this if I'm just like her," So it felt like I was part of a continuum, and then other members of the family were obsessed. My auntie's a wonderful academic historian at Oxford University and writes great books. My mum and dad were journalists, which is history adjacent, really, trying to find out what happened. You're trying to work out what is going on, whereas great historians like you work out what happened 50, 60, 100 years ago. Mum and dad would try and work out what happened a couple of weeks ago. So, but the skills are very similar, and it's the sort of first draft of history. So, and then in our kind of recreation time, we just try. Britain is wonderful. It's got this incredible concentration of historical sites and museums, and buildings and battlefields and castles, and we every single weekend we just go and visit them. That was no other option. I didn't know there was any other pastime. And we hated it as kids, obviously. We'd rather been kicking a football around, doing something else, going to McDonald's. But then I got Stockholm Syndrome and started to enjoy it. Yeah. And now I inflict it on my kids.
So they're going through exactly the same. So what about the importance of history then? Because isn't it surely just a sort of an academic subject or, the roots of your childhood? It roots us, yes, but what do you think is the wider significance of remembering history? Why is it so important?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in the 90s. I sort of came of age in the 90s, and there was a bit of a sense that a lot of people said, I said, I'm going to do history at university, and people would say, what are you that for? And they said, often they'd say, do you want to be a teacher? And I'd say, well, first of all, what's wrong with that? But secondly, there's lots of things you can do with history, But there was a sense in the 90s that history was no longer hugely relevant. It wasn't sort of viscerally important because the internet was still the future. Paradigms were shifting. Everything was changing. Liberal democracy had won. The Cold War was over. Great power politics was over. And of course, the last 10 years has just shown history. I mean, obviously it was nonsense, but history it just feels like it's as important as ever as we see these. We've lived through pandemic. We're living now through superpower rivalry again. We're living through regional tension along the Himalayas between two rising powers, India and China. We are dealing with the rebirth of nationalism, of strong men, of politics through sort of strong men leaders. These are all things, and of course we're dealing with enormous challenges caused by climate change. Although in the 17th century, of course, they couldn't see it as holistically as we now see it as part of a big global system. So history is essential. It's essential to understand where things come from, to understand the world around us.
Yeah.
But it's also essential because it's about training it's a mindset, it's a set of skills. So history is of two things. History is both all these wonderful paintings around us here in this club. History is things that have happened, events that have happened that are worthy of study. And for example, the partition of Israel-Palestine in the second half of the 20th century is essential to understanding so much the politics of that region of the world. The decisions taken in the aftermath of the American Civil War around Reconstruction and the endowment of African Americans with their constitutional rights or not? Those are huge decisions that continue to resonate to this day. But also history, probably more importantly, is actually about your own self, your own mind, developing a historical mindset, outlook, approach to life. And in a world, and that is about working out what's going on, working about what happened, using sources, using evidence, challenging yourself, always looking for more, not settling for received wisdom. And in a world where we are now unexpectedly overwhelmed by a barrage of propaganda, by bad actors, bad news, fake news from huge amount of ignorance, anti-expert feeling on the internet and elsewhere. It is absolutely essential that we're all armed with this historical mindset. We go, well, if I'm being told something, is that true? How do I find out if it's true? Well, the answer is I have to look for other sources. I have to weigh these sources for bias. Like, what is the BBC likely to be more accurate than my mad Brexit uncle on Facebook, who's just posted sort of reams of stuff that's copied and pasted from some website I don't know where it's from?
Yes.
Do I believe the New York Times? Do I believe what news sources do I go to? And that is a historical training, a historical outlook really arms you. It inoculates you against the virus of fake news.
And that whole thing around fake news, of course, we've given examples of climate change and other kind of a rise of power and narrative. But what about the rewriting of history? In a sense, as historians, we do always, with new sources, rewrite, I guess, at times. But isn't there concern that in certain spheres, particularly in certain parts of Europe, places that were once countries behind the Iron Curtain, are you concerned by that rewriting of history and how we can address that?
Well, everyone's always... You rewrite history brilliantly. I love reading all your books, and I'm very excited when you do rewrite history. Everyone's always rewriting all the time, really. Bad actors and good actors and academics and filmmakers, of course, Hollywood directors. And so there's a constant... We all tell each other stories about our past. That's what my grandmother was doing when I was a kid. She was rewriting history. She was telling me how great her grandpa was, and then I read the history books and realised that he was a bit of a dodgy old, character. So everyone has the right, I think, to interpret history and rewrite it, but they don't have the right to have their interpretation of history scrutinised and challenged. And so that's what historians do. Historians are constantly trying to piece together a picture of what happened in the past, using new sources they become available. Obviously, digitization of sources has been so powerful, but we've also got new science-adjacent or scientific methods now, archaeology, looking at teeth, bones, human DNA, whatever it might be. Incredibly exciting new ways to retell stories of the past. We are retelling huge stories from our past, like was the Germanic, Saxon, Jutish settlement of the Isles. Was that an incredibly violent genocidal event, or was it just one elite replacing another? And that's the history there is so fascinating. It goes from one to the other. I love following that debate. And the same's true of the Vikings. So who are these Vikings? Are they coming into Northumbria? Are they coming into East Anglia and just murdering everybody and replacing them with blonde-haired Danes and Norwegians? Or are they just adapting, perhaps like the Normans a few centuries later? They're just bringing over their sort of elites and they're taking charge of existing social structures. Now, those are things that don't feel hugely controversial. That when you move into areas around British imperial heroes, when you talk about Winston Churchill, it touches a raw nerve, because these are people that we associate that are somehow central to a story of Britain that we tell ourselves in this country. There was a school the other day that changed their house names in Yorkshire from Nelson and Raleigh and Drake to contemporary figures, that admired contemporary figures. And what do we think about that? Well, I think we know as historians that every generation will choose what parts of history to emphasise and what heroes to pluck out of the past, and I think that's kind of inevitable. And I guess it's just for those of us that want certain stories told in history, we need to make sure we get out and doing it like you are, and writing great books and engaging the public, and perhaps taking on those counter narratives as they emerge.
and keeping it alive. And within that, of course, of relevance to what we're discussing as well today, this whole arena of military intelligence, you think it's important to remember? It's probably a trick question, really. It's not intended to be a trick question, but do you see it as vitally important that we should tell the stories of military intelligence alongside and within those other narratives?
Of course it is, because the story, I mean, military intelligence, a little bit like other forms of military activity that take place, although military can be absolutely on the battlefield, and there are intelligence officers on battlefields as we speak, but it's perhaps would be seen as a little bit more of an activity that takes place away from where the bullets are flying. But things like that, things like logistics, those are essential to talk about and learn about, because those are how you win wars. You know, anyone can arm a bunch of 18-year-olds and send them charging off towards the sound of the guns. Like I'm reminded in the 18th century that I know a little bit more about. There was this the Spanish were completely hopeless at sea. The British kept defeating Spanish fleets and ships wherever they came across them. But what's interesting, if you study the British accounts, they had huge admiration for the bravery and the seamanship of these Spanish sailors often. They were brave to a fault. They were hysterically brave. They were like any other 23-year-old, desperate to hurl themselves aboard lay themselves alongside an enemy ship and climb aboard and fight it out for their king. That's not what was lacking. What was lacking was like the fiscal structure to support these ships, to build dockyards, to build dry docks, the intelligence backup they needed. Yeah. They were tasked wrongly. The recruitment was terrible. The stores were rotting. That was the problem with Spanish ships. It wasn't that the Spanish were lame. So I think that any military, any serious historian who wants to understand warfare and military history needs to be absolutely looking at that. And we sort of get a little bit, sometimes we can get attracted by the bright, shiny object of battlefield heroism and winning medals on the battlefield, and gallantry medals. And of course those things are fascinating, but actually military intelligence, if you look at the story of D-Day, for example, D-Day is one time when actually most people know more about military intelligence, the logistics, the planning, than they do actually about the sole VC that was won on D-Day by a British soldier. We don't remember the names of the lads that charged up Sword Beach and took out individual bunkers, because we understand, I think, quite a sophisticated understanding that actually D-Day is the product of an astonishing effort by photo reconnaissance Spitfires flying at virtually treetop height up and down these beaches, getting the inland areas, building an extraordinarily super accurate picture of what would wait for these men when they landed on the beaches. We understand that X-Craft went ashore with commandos that would take samples of the sand and bring it back so people could identify what beaches would be appropriate for driving heavy tracked vehicles up. We understand that the intelligence around what units were positioned where. For example, Calais was much more heavily defended than the beaches of Normandy, with on the whole better units of the Wehrmacht, the German army. And I think. And then, of course, we all know about the famous counter-espionage, the fake news, the stories that were sold to the Germans to try and...
The whole double agents.
The enormous effort that went into pretending there was a giant US Army group in Kent when it was all just made of rubber and styrofoam and plywood. And General Patton down there furious that he wasn't allowed to go on the initial wave of landings. So I think something like D-Day is an area where we are correct to actually spend more time, I think, talking about planning and intelligence than we are about the bravery of the lads who go over the top. But another area that's true, I think, is the huge successes of late 1918 from August onwards. My impression is that it's the intelligence picture, it's the working out where to attack, where individual. I'm going to define intelligence quite broadly here, but working out where individual German gun positions are, bringing down artillery fire on those positions with great accuracy, and then preparing units like the famous Midland Division when they stormed the Hindenburg Line. They knew exactly what to expect in terms of what was coming, landmarks, defences. And obviously nothing was ever perfect, but that preparation is so important. And then you can put those brave, incredibly gung-ho and fantastically capable young soldiers with their NCOs into those situations, and they'll perform well. And you give them equipment like a Lewis gun or a flamethrower or rifle grenades that weren't available before in 1914 to 16, say. So I think it's a bit long answer, but I think intelligence fits into that as we start to have an appreciation of what really moves the dial on the battlefield.
And when you look at all of that, do you have a particular favourite story around intelligence that just resonates with you?
Well, I do think Sorga. I think the revelation that Stalin finding out from a very senior intelligence source in Japan that the Japanese were not going to join. It always sends a sort of shiver down my spine that the Japanese were not going to invade the Soviet Union alongside their allies. The Germans will forget, we talk about the Axis powers. They did nothing. They were totally hopeless, the Axis powers, in terms of their cooperation. They launched one combined operation, I think it was in Madagascar or somewhere, in the whole of the Second World War. And had the Japanese invaded Siberia in 1941 alongside Operation Barbarossa, and it would have been, potentially game-changing for the Soviet Union and for the Axis side. So I do find the fact that Sorga was able to tell Stalin that the Japanese did not enjoy fighting the Red Army when they did so a few years before, when they probed into Siberia, and they were not going to do so again. And Stalin was able to redeploy huge numbers of men from Siberia to Moscow just in time for the counterattack around Moscow in late 1941. And I think that's got to be up there pretty high with in terms of the impact of intelligence on the course of world history.
That's interesting, because that's not an example that I was expecting. And it's not one you hear very often, so that's a very interesting perspective. Well, around this whole military intelligence, it's about secrets, as we've said. Do you think, the documents are being declassified, not all of them, of course there's always going to be those from certain agencies like MI5, MI6, where MI5 does release some of its stuff, but also some stuff from the War Office and other operations that won't be ever available, but a large amount is being declassified. And what do you see as the value to share these once sensitive secrets?
Well, it's magic. It's so extraordinary when you're in the National Archives and you're reading things that at the time were the most top secret, most unbelievably important. Churchill ruminating on the possibility of a gigantic war against the Soviet Union as early as 1945. Just imagining what that might have been. And imagining how incredibly sensitive that, you could not admit that the British government were even thinking this, as they were still allegedly fighting alongside they were fighting alongside the Red Army at the end of the Second World War. So there's something so exciting about it, and there's something really important about it. And this is why history is really important, because if you look at the way that our officials and our planners and our senior military and political figures dealt with crisis in the past, it teaches you, well, this is what's going on now as well. Not precise parallels, but this is when they're saying to you, we've got this whole pandemic thing under control in the February of 2020, you think, well, that's interesting, because I've looked at correspondence with David Lloyd George talking about the pandemic of 1918, and they had no idea what they were doing. And it makes you think, I wonder if I should be a little bit more sceptical about what's going on at the moment and hold the government to account if I'm a journalist, or if I'm in a position of being able to do that, opposition MP or opposition minister, for example. So I do think it's hugely valuable, because by uncovering what our leaders were thinking, how their thought processes work, how their decision-making works in the past, you can gain an insight into what's going on at the moment as well, and look at some of the pressures on them, and some of the and that is why that's why it's we need to go through these documents. We need people like you that are there combing through, teaching us about decisions that have been made in the past, and the thought thinking that goes into those decisions.
Of course, one aspect of history that is popular is the fictionalising of history. Do you think that's kind of okay in a way, or does it blur the boundaries, or will people understand, look, this is fiction? And sometimes it's a very fine line, particularly with spies and espionage. And is that our fascination? And what's your take on, does that bother you because the facts might be slightly not quite as they should be?
I don't really have a good answer to this because, yes, it does bother me. When I watch American U-boat film, the Americans take all the credit for breaking the Enigma code, for example. But at the same time, I don't have a solution to it because I believe in art and creativity, and I believe that Shakespeare should be allowed to write Shakespeare plays in which he paints Henry V in a ridiculously positive light. or that's our prerogative. I'm not going to go into the Tate Gallery and rip Turner's painting of Hannibal crossing the Alps off the wall because it's inaccurate, or some of the wonderful portrayals of historical painting. I mean, I love historical painting. So I don't. Do I think there should be like a sort of committee of historians that strikes down popular culture? No, I don't. Do I therefore just think it's dependent and incumbent on us through podcasts? We've got all these tools nowadays, social media, when The Crown comes out on Netflix, it just feels so incredibly realistic. It's so
good
well
example,
made.
yeah.
And that does change how people think about recent history. Now that's a challenge. But the answer to that is more history, not less, I expect. And the answer to that is getting out there, engaging with the public where they are. And if you've got problems with The Crown, then let's get your articles, do your viral videos and do your live streaming and release your TikToks all about The Crown and what actually happened. But there's not much point, sitting in your library getting furious about it in private. So I think the historical community needs to get out there, get on the front foot. But it can be, it can be incredibly. Fake news on Facebook about recent injustices or recent alleged crimes has led to virtually genocide in Burma, in Myanmar, Burma, with the Rohingya. So whether it's big Hollywood productions or badly written popular history books like the Fox News hosts do in the US about sort of dodgy bits of American history, I don't think we can stop that. But what we can do is just try and make sure we're getting our arguments out there and perhaps our version of history out there, and that's all about. It's about museums, and it's about historians, and history influencers like me, if that's what I am.
Yeah.
And it's about making sure you're not ceding that battlefield.
Can I ask you finally, if there's one secret in that whole kind of military intelligence field that you would like to be declassified, or you think that needs to be declassified, what would it be? What would you really like to know?
I'd be really interested to know more about Nazi sympathies within the British elite in the build-up and during the first few years of the Second World War. A lot of British conservative-leaning politicians and wealthy people looked at Hitler and Stalin in the late 1930s and thought, we'd rather have Hitler than Stalin. And I think there's probably some quite interesting stuff there with some quite well-known people that we'll find out more about one day.
Dan, to leave us on a cliffhanger like that. The interview today was for the National Centre for Military Intelligence, where we've been sharing the secrets of history.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.